and Mass Communication here at Florida International University. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Leadership Webinar Series of the Kopenhaver Center for the Advancement of Women in Communication. The mission of our center is to empower both young women professionals and academics in order to develop those visionaries of tomorrow who can make a difference in their communities and in their professions. So we are delighted you have joined us for this webinar today. You will gain a great deal of knowledge and helpful information from our speakers. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Maria Elena Villar, our host for this webinar today, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here in the Kopenhaver Center. And for those of you joining us online, we're happy to have you. And after the remarks by our speakers today, we welcome you, your questions, both from here in the audience and in the chat feature in online. So it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. First, I will introduce Carolyn Bronstein. She's Associate Professor of Communication in the College of Communication at DePaul University. She's a founding faculty director of the Op-Ed Project, Public Voices Fellowship at DePaul. It's a program it's a program of the National Op-Ed Project, which seeks to empower female faculty members and male faculty members of color as thought leaders and participants in significant public debates and policymaking efforts. She's a recognized leader in mass communication education and the former director of the Mass Communication Program at DePaul University, and a graduate of the Scripps Howard Academic Leadership Academy at Louisiana State University. Bronstein holds a bachelor's and master's degree in communication from Stanford University and earned her PhD in journalism and mass communication from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. She's an award-winning teacher and scholar and the author of Battling Pornography, an American feminist anti-pornography movement, 1976 to 1986, which was published in 2011. And it received the 2012 Emily Toth Award for Best Single Work in Women's Studies. She's co-editor with our other speaker, Kathy Fitzpatrick, of Ethics in Public Relations, Responsible Advocacy, published in 2006. Her scholarship on gender representation, social responsibility, and feminism has been published in a wide range of media, including Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly, Journalism and Mass Communication Monographs, Feminist Media Studies, and many other publications. She's currently at work on a collection of essays which examine the impact of pornography on American politics and culture. Our other speaker today is Kathy Fitzpatrick. She is our very own professor and associate director for graduate programs and research in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication right here at Florida International University. She formerly directed the graduate and undergraduate programs in public relations and advertising at Quinnipiac University, DePaul University, University of Florida, and Southern Methodist University. In 2009 to 2011, she was a research fellow in the Center for Public Diplomacy at the Annenberg School at the University of Southern California. She's an internationally recognized scholar in public relations, public diplomacy, and ethics. Her books and monographs include U.S. Public Diplomacy in a Post-9/11 World, U.S. Public Diplomacy's Neglected Domestic Mandate, Ethics in Public Relations, and many other articles and manuscripts. Her research has been published in top scholarly journals in communication and diplomacy, including the Hague Journal of Diplomacy, the International Journal of Strategic Communications, the Journal of Public Relations Research, and many others. She serves as co-editor of the Palgrave Macmillan book series on global public diplomacy and serves on the international advisory boards of the Hague Journal of Diplomacy and Public Diplomacy magazine. She also serves on editorial review boards of several other publications, and she formerly served as the head of the Educators Academy in the Public Relations Society of America and is a former president of the Dallas chapter of PRSA. So Professor Fitzpatrick received her Juris Doctor from Southern Methodist University and a master's and bachelor's degree in journalism from West Virginia. So I am delighted to welcome our two speakers. and I'm looking forward to hearing.
Thank you, Maria Elena. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Lillian. I'd like to start by thanking you and the Kopenhaver Center for hosting forums such as this. You give us all an opportunity to talk about some very important issues to women in communication all over the world. Our topic today, the focus today, is on the importance of leadership training in helping students and professionals advance into leadership positions in the communication industries. But before we get started on that, I'd like to welcome my friend and colleague, Carolyn Bronstein, who is joining us virtually from Chicago, where it is, I just checked, a balmy 27 degrees. Welcome, Carolyn.
Thank you. Thanks, Kathy, and hi, everyone. I'm so delighted to be here virtually. I wish I were there to enjoy the Florida sunshine. I'd like to also really start by thanking the Kopenhaver Center for initiating and supporting these very important conversations about professional development and educational opportunities for women in the communication and media industries, and for giving us a chance today to talk about leadership, which is really a critically important topic for our students, for journalism and mass communication faculty, and really for the future of our professional fields, and dare I say, for the future of our democracy. Maria Elena, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. I don't think I have to add anything. I think you covered me pretty completely there. I'll just say one additional thing about the Op-Ed Project Public Voices Fellowship. This is a national thought leadership initiative, and it trains female faculty and male faculty of color to translate their research for the public, especially by writing op-eds on matters of public policy and leading social issues of our times. So I've been considering these issues around leadership and how to propel marginalized voices to the forefront to leadership positions for some time now. And I'll also add that Kathy and I have been interested in this topic of leadership since we were faculty members at DePaul together about 10 years ago. And we were noticing the definitive trend toward higher female enrollments in journalism and mass communication programs, which we naturally assumed would translate to greater numbers of female leaders in our industries. And while women have made gains in legacy media during that time, and actually now hold just over a quarter of the leading managerial positions at newspaper, television, and radio companies nationwide, I think we've all been fairly disappointed to see that new media and technology companies like Amazon, Snapchat, Twitter, and Google have not diversified their leadership teams to a great extent. And so it's this reality, the disconnect between what we see in our classrooms, which are full of bright, motivated, hardworking, and ambitious women, and the reality of male-dominated leadership teams and corporate boards. I think it's this reality that's really stimulated us as a team to think critically about leadership and how we might adapt our curricula in our fields to help shift this gender imbalance. So I'll turn it back over now to Kathy, who I think is going to discuss the idea of curricular reform.
Thank you, Carolyn. Yes, as both an educator and an administrator, I spend a lot of time thinking about program and curriculum development in communication. Of course, that's what we academics should be doing, trying to ensure that our programs that are up to date and we're providing the best possible training for the students in our classes. In recent years, with the advent of digital media and related changes in the news and information environment, that change has become both more exciting and more challenging. More exciting because of the tremendous opportunity for schools of communication to help shape modern media and communication. Yet more challenging because of the critical need to keep pace with the dynamic changes taking place in the communication industries. As communication scholar John Pavlik put it, in this new age, every assumption about media education deserves, even demands, reconsideration. And if the many reports and white papers on the need to reform communication education released in the past few years are any indication, there are a lot of folks out there who agree. There is less agreement, however, on exactly what curricular form should look like. For example, there have been calls for a lot more focus on digital skills training across multiple platforms using the teaching hospital model. At the same time, some have cautioned to not put too much emphasis on digital skills because we don't want to lose sight of traditional values and standards. There have been calls for adapting our curricula in ways that will help students better compete for jobs. At the same time, there have been calls to put less emphasis on teaching students how to get jobs and more on teaching our students how to become entrepreneurs who will create their own jobs. There have been calls for more curricular integration among the communication disciplines. At the same time, there have been calls to keep those traditional walls up. There have been calls for more professionals and fewer scholars on communication school faculties. At the same time, there have been calls for more research faculty and fewer professionals on communications studies. In other words, the only consensus that seems to have emerged thus far is that there is a need to reform communication education. And on that point, Carolyn and I agree. But we're not here today to argue for a particular approach or a model of communication education in this digital age. We'll leave that for another time. We do want to suggest, however, that whatever direction schools and colleges decide to go, there should be a place in the curriculum for leadership training. Let me ask both the educators and the students in the room, or those of you tuning in virtually, a question. How many of you are in schools or colleges whose mission statements say they are preparing students to become leaders in their field? And if you are here in FIU's SJMC, raise your hand. I'm guessing a lot of hands went out also in the virtual world. Now, how many of you are in schools and colleges that have incorporated formal leadership training in the curriculum? Not so much, right? The little research that has been conducted on this topic indicates that the answer to that question is very few. And that's why Carolyn and I think today's conversation is so important. We'd like to see more emphasis placed on leadership education so that it becomes a priority in journalism and mass communication. We believe leadership training would help students develop both the knowledge and skills they need to lead dynamic industries, and perhaps more importantly, to develop a leadership mindset oriented to innovation. Consider how leadership training woven throughout the curriculum would prepare students to function as leaders at various stages of their careers. For example, as thought leaders who envision and create the next communication revolutions from the ground up. As corporate leaders who manage culturally diverse, complex global media and communication organizations at the highest levels of governance. And as team leaders who direct initiatives that require outstanding interpersonal skills and the ability to leverage one's own talents as well as those of others. This type of training, we believe, is especially important for female students. And so at this point, I'll throw it back to Carolyn, and she's going to talk a little bit about the leadership gender gap in the media industries and the factors that seem to contribute to the dearth of female leaders. Carolyn.
Great, thanks. All right, so I'm going to direct your attention to the slides. Since I'm not there with you in person, I think this will help you follow my comments a little bit better. Let's start by talking about some of the numbers in communication education. Women pursue communication education in disproportionately higher numbers than men. So for those students who are in the room, you'll notice in your classes, it's predominantly female. 64% of undergraduate students who enrolled in journalism and mass communication, JMC, programs in fall 2012 were female. And 67% of JMC master's program students in fall 2012 were female. So in our classrooms, we have a predominance of female students. So you would expect that women would be moving into leadership roles in the JMC industries in very robust numbers, given their majority status in JMC education programs nationwide. But is this happening? And sadly, the answer is no. Women's career progress and ascent into leadership roles in our JMC fields is lagging relative to their male peers. So the reality for our fields is that women are typically not reaching the highest corporate or other organizational governance positions. And one very startling statistic that we should all be aware of is that just 23 of the current Fortune 500 CEO positions are held by women. And of these 23, only 3 of those are held by women of color. And on the screen, you see 2 prominent examples of women CEOs in the media fields. We see Gracia Martore, CEO of Gannett News, and of course Marissa Mayer, CEO of Yahoo. But once we have these couple of pictures and a few more names that you might recognize, the well runs dry. There are no other female CEOs after we get past the 23, at least for the Fortune 500 CEO companies. So the leadership gender gap, this picture seems to have moved up on us. I'm not sure why, but in April 2014, the Wall Street Journal announced its lineup for its first International Media and Technology Conference. And it was 17 male keynoters, and they represented Google and Snapchat and other new media companies, but 0 women. And when Twitter went in 2013 to have its IPO, there was a lot of controversy about the fact that there were no women on its board. And so Marjorie Scardino, who's pictured here, was actually the first woman added to the Twitter board of directors at the time of its initial public offering. So the economist Bill Roth points out a number of business reasons why it actually makes a lot of sense to have women on every corporate board. First of all, women are the world's largest consumers. Those of you in the audience who are advertising majors probably recognize this fact right off the board. Women make 80% of all U.S. consumer purchases. Women have annual buying power of $8 trillion per year. They control 60% of wealth in the United States. Women are growing in numbers as entrepreneurs. There are over 10 million women-owned or partially owned businesses in the U.S., which employ more than 27 million people. And Latinas are the fastest growing segment of entrepreneurs in the U.S. So these are all compelling business reasons why women ought to be in leadership positions and certainly ought to be on corporate boards. The second reason has to do with women's activism. We know that women are leaders nationwide and worldwide in social and environmental activism. Women are also the greatest communicators. They vote, they tweet, they donate, and they volunteer in greater numbers than men. Female customers are also the ones who are engaging with brands, and they often develop significant product and company loyalties. This is the second reason that Bill Roth describes. The third is that women tend to be the ones who most frequently demand CSR, corporate social responsibility. Those of you coming out of the PR classes at FIU and elsewhere who are listening, you probably know that term, CSR. So women are often the ones that drive activist responses when corporations do not practice CSR. So for example, boycotts and other consumer responses to corporate abuses. And the idea of boycotts is actually a really powerful one. There's a study from Cone Communications that indicates that just under half of all consumers have boycotted a product or a company due to socially irresponsible behavior. And this is a trend that is accelerating because of the power of digital social networks like Twitter, where you can tell your friends and the people in your circles right away, don't buy American Apparel because of a particular ad, or don't buy a particular fruit product because the migrant laborers are not being treated fairly. So if you look at social media use, that is also predominantly female, which makes us realize again that you want to have women in leadership positions. You want to be hearing their voices on corporate boards and everywhere. And finally, from Bill Roth, and I apologize, the PowerPoint formatting of the PowerPoints doesn't seem to like the Adobe Connect format too much, so the spacing is a little off. But in any case, companies with female board members have higher profits. And I mean, it really ought to stop, that reason alone ought to catch American businesses' attention, global businesses' attention. Research from the think tank Catalyst shows us a very strong correlation between corporate financial performance and gender diversity. More diverse corporate boards produce higher rates of return. Diversity produces better results across the board, and when you add women and people of color to boards, it leads to more independence, more innovation, and better governance. So there are incredibly persuasive reasons why we ought to be seeing women in leadership roles, but we're not to the extent that we would see gender parity. So why is there a leadership gender gap if women leaders boost profits and accomplish everything else that Bill Roth points out? And if we know that it's just a matter of social justice as well to have diverse boards and diverse leadership. Well, there are pervasive gender stereotypes that characterize leadership as a male trait that we are still struggling with in our society, and we really haven't moved past. So we'll see this, I think, very much in the next presidential election if Hillary Clinton is the presumed Democratic nominee. I think sometimes you will see her opponents described as strong and rational and decisive. I'm assuming her opponents are going to be male from the looks of the current field. Whereas women who are in leadership positions are often labeled demanding, bossy, domineering, arrogant, emotional, and self-promoting. So these are the same leadership behaviors, but when they're practiced by a woman, they get one set of labels. When they're practiced by a man, they get another set of labels. And women in our society are quite sensitive. Everyone is sensitive to how they are portrayed. Nobody really wants to be called bossy or domineering. So it can sometimes persuade women to step away from leadership roles or not to pursue them aggressively because of the fear of being in the desire not to be labeled in these negative ways. Another issue that contributes to the leadership gender gap is a lack of female leaders as role models and mentors. I'm sure that you have heard in your classes, and we all teach the importance of mentorship and sponsorship for everyone to move forward in their careers, women and men alike. Sometimes women, though, and particularly women of color, face great challenges in identifying appropriate mentors. Female mentors can offer social support, role modeling, and advice about overcoming discriminatory obstacles. Now, this is not to say that men cannot be excellent mentors for women. I think Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook and author of Lean In, would tell you that Larry Summers, former president of Harvard and her employer at the World Bank, was the most wonderful mentor imaginable. But there are, of course, issues about obstacles that are particular for women and women of color that a male mentor may not be able to offer insight into. Women of color in particular may need mentors who can advise about advancing past barriers that are connected to both gender and race. And this is a complex of problems that a white male mentor may not be able to fully address. There's also a lack of access to networking opportunities. There's a perception that women are not as effectively networked as men, and it is hard for women to break into male-dominated networks. Women are often seen as gate crashers, or they're trying to push into male spaces where they don't belong. The picture in your, I don't know which, it's in my upper right-hand corner. I don't know how that's translating for you, but the picture on the screen is Ellen Pao. And if you haven't been following this lawsuit, you really ought to. Ellen Pao was fired from the VC firm, venture capital firm Kleiner Perkins in Silicon Valley, even though she had a track record that was better in terms of companies going public than many of her male counterparts who were not fired and were promoted. And the current lawsuit, which was just advanced yesterday, and she's been told that she can sue now for as much as $160 million in punitive damages. One of the most damning pieces of evidence thus far is that she has testimony in her favor that she was not invited to male-only dinner parties and after-hours get-togethers where business was discussed because it was said, and this is the quote, "Women kill the buzz." So this is a very powerful and current example of lack of access to networking opportunities where deals are made and relationships are generated and relationships are built. And she was excluded from these opportunities. So I really encourage you to follow this lawsuit. Finally, another reason, masculine culture of some corporations can hinder women from building social capital. A great example that there are various terrific books that have been written on the legends of Walmart, but Walmart's executive retreats through the early 2000s often took place at Sam Walton's ranch in Texas, and they involved hunting and fishing. And of course, you always hear legends of weekend golf outings where business is conducted. And hunting and fishing was not particularly a lot of the women executives at Walmart did not feel comfortable going on a weekend retreat hunting and fishing. It just wasn't part of their culture, and they were dissuaded, many of them were dissuaded from attending. Golf outings on weekends, a lot of women have made the point that if you were also trying to juggle a family, or you have any kind of outside life from work, which hopefully we all do, that the weekends it's difficult to give those up and devote those to corporate socializing. Finally, I think Sheryl Sandberg has been really the leading advocate these days of pointing out the psychological and social barriers that make women's ascension to top roles less direct and less likely. She talks in Lean In, which is a very important book that you ought to read. And for the students in the room, you might want to read her second book, Lean In for Graduates, which looks at leadership challenges for new graduates, like negotiating your first salary, for example. But she's pointed out the leadership ambition gap, which stems from these interior psychological factors: female self-doubt, lack of positive efficacy, which Kathy had mentioned as a leadership mindset, and the negative social labels that can attach to powerful and successful women. Going back to one of the first things I said about women, successful and powerful women being called arrogant and bossy and domineering. Again, no one wants to be called these things necessarily, so it can contribute to a reticence on the part of especially young women to pursue leadership opportunities. So we want to recognize that these are all factors that are contributing to the leadership gender gap. These psychological and social barriers that Sandberg identified also include expectations around family. Young women in particular are very vulnerable to gendered expectations that they should be prioritizing personal roles, and those include marriage and motherhood. And of course, we want to encourage everyone to pursue the family life and the personal life that a person desires. But we have to recognize that sometimes this can affect the way an employee is treated in the workplace. For example, not sent overseas for a 1 year or 2 year special project because it might damage a relationship that looks like it's leading towards marriage. That's the kind of paternalistic decision that can be made for women that can actually negatively impact their careers. There's also the issue of tokenism, and that's the idea of having one woman in an organization, one person of color in an organization, or one female person of color in an organization. And there's a great psychological toll that's associated with tokenism, the feeling that you only have the job because you're a woman, or you only have the job because you're a woman of color or a man of color. And when you're the only one in an organization, your colleagues are less likely to react to you in terms of your skills and your individual competencies. And instead, your color or your gender becomes the only lens through which you are seen. That becomes your identity in the organization. Let's get the female perspective, for example. There's also the idea of benevolent sexism. And the example that I gave a moment ago about maybe not sending a woman on a 1 to 2 year overseas experience or placement connects to benevolent sexism. Women are routinely denied access to more challenging developmental experiences because of this form of subtle sexism and the desire to really protect women from volatile situations or situations that might interrupt their personal lives. So think to yourselves, think about being the station manager and at a television news station. You've got 2 broadcast journalism interns. You've got 1 male and you have 1 female, and they're equally talented. You've got a call about a 5-alarm fire, or maybe you have a call about a dangerous prison riot. Who are you going to send to cover that? Which intern are you going to dispatch to cover those stories? Benevolent sexism would suggest that you might think twice about sending a young woman to cover a 5-alarm fire, or sending a young woman into a prison that's out of control because of the inherent danger to her, and then choosing instead to send the man who is perceived as stronger and better able to take care of himself. There wasn't an intent to derail a woman's career there, but the benevolent sexism propelled the man forward into challenging professional situations that will contribute to his resume, his experience, and his ability to move into the next position. So what we see is a brain drain in communication organizations. Our top female communication students are statistically less likely to move into leadership positions in our fields because of all of these factors that we've just reviewed. And they're even less likely to move into those leadership positions than male counterparts who come from outside of JMC education. So we should stop and consider that for a moment. That's a real problem, that our own students are not moving into leadership roles, but male students in other disciplines are more likely to lead our media and technology companies. And the numbers are really disheartening. I'll call your attention to probably the worst statistic in our industries, which has to do with executive creative directors at ad agencies. There was a 2014 study and roundtable in Ad Age that confirmed that just 3% of executive creative directors at ad agencies are female. And I know that at FIU and elsewhere, nationally, where we teach advertising, the greatest number of advertising students say they intend to become creative directors. This is the most popular career choice. And for young women in the room who see that just 3% of women are making it into that role at top agencies, and all agencies really, again, it's very disheartening. And a statistic for you from public relations, women hold 75% of public relations jobs, but just 20% of the senior leadership positions. All right, so at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Kathy, who is going to tell us a little bit about, I'm going to turn it back over to Kathy, and then I am going to come back and talk to you about strategies for developing yourself as a leader. First, Kathy is going to talk about the way that educators can introduce leadership in classrooms.
Thank
Kathy.
you, Carolyn. Yes, I want to talk a little bit about the challenge of teaching leadership. And I would begin by saying that the focus of this conversation is on women, helping women advance, our students and professionals. But we believe this is a problem also for men, for male students. And so my comments with respect to teaching leadership really apply across the board. At the same time, I think we all agree that the statistics that Carolyn shared are pretty stark. And so, when we think about the leadership gap and the gender gap associated with leadership, then that's something that certainly is important to women, but it also should be important to men. And I think that one of the things that I'm just beginning to see a bit of is that people are recognizing that these conversations about advancing women are not only conversations for women. We need to get men involved in these conversations and in helping men develop the leadership skills that will allow them to lead organizations, lead teams, and so forth. Then I think we also help them become more thoughtful leaders who recognize the talents of women and the contributions that women can make to a media enterprise, a communications firm, or whatever. So let's think about teaching leadership. More than 2 decades ago, public relations scholar Bob Heath argued that the primary test of a professional school's curriculum is whether graduates are competing successfully for positions in practice. And when he was talking at that time, the focus was on the need to integrate more management training into a public relations curriculum that was primarily technical. Bob argued that if we taught students technical skills, then they would become technicians. If we teach them management, they will become managers. So you see where I'm going with this, right? So if we expect our students, both male and female, to move into leadership positions in the new global communications marketplace, then we need to take the JMC curriculum to the next level and integrate leadership training to help them develop the leadership skills that they will need. The challenge, of course, is how. And as we grapple with this challenge of how to teach leadership, there are myriad questions that need to be addressed. For example, what are the core components of a leadership curriculum? Should leadership training involve standalone courses or be incorporated across the curriculum? Who is best qualified to teach leadership in media, in journalism, in public relations, in advertising? How will leadership skills and competencies be assessed? Should leadership training be the focus of only graduate and not undergraduate programs? For example, the Commission on Education and Public Relations, and its most recent, which isn't too recent, they're working on a new one, but it was in 2006, the undergraduate report didn't talk about leadership. But in the more recent 2012 Commission report that focused on graduate education, they identified leadership as an important capability. So I think we're moving in that direction, but that doesn't answer the question about whether it's something we should be incorporating more at the graduate level or the undergraduate level. The interesting thing about all of this is that there are no generally accepted standards for an ideal leadership curriculum. But we can learn a lot, I think, from schools of business and other schools, a few other schools who have taken the lead in attempting to identify the core content and objectives of leadership training. These programs can provide some conceptual frameworks for us to consider, as well as some practical advice in terms of how to develop a leadership curriculum. For example, a recent study of agricultural leadership programs identified a high-level agreement among educators in that area on the curricular objectives of effective leadership training in the field. And I think you'll see these kind of cut across disciplines. Those objectives included helping students develop what we've been talking about, the leadership mindset, a personal vision of leadership, and to discover their personal leadership strengths. And another objective is to provide opportunities for students to apply leadership theories and practice in a structured environment to promote the success of a team or organization, something that is very important in communication today. And so these aims that the agricultural folks are looking at, the business school folks and others are looking at, really show what kinds of qualities that have been identified as most needed. For example, one study found that the leadership qualities that were most lacking among our students, among our graduates, are the ability to collaborate effectively, adeptness in critical thinking, and knowledge of how to communicate with diverse constituencies. In fact, the organizations that will be hiring our students have cited this leadership void, or the dearth of trained leaders, as a critical issue for organizations of all stripes. One recent survey of more than 5,000 global business executives conducted by a leading management firm found that, pointed to the need to improve leadership development. Where's the pipeline of future leaders? These researchers ask. And they said improving leadership development is the single most important human resources priority for international organizations. In the United States alone, approximately 25% of the $50 billion spent every year on corporate training is devoted to leadership development. The goal is to enable employees to navigate environments characterized by rapid change and increasing complexity. And is there any environment more affected by rapid change and increasing complexity than communications? And for that reason, in developing a leadership curriculum, we should look at some of these core qualities that have been identified by other folks, but we also need to consider the unique aspects of careers in communications. What are the special competencies and traits that might be important in leadership development? For example, let's look at public relations. The Planck Center for Leadership in Public Relations, which, by the way, is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year, polled leaders in the field on the qualities a public relations leader must possess. And these experts had a long list of traits that they identified. They said a public relations leader must be visionary, proactive, empathetic, confident, courageous, inspiring, flexible, knowledgeable, ethical, adaptable, intuitive, curious, committed, energetic, entrepreneurial, and collaborative. There are two things you'll notice about the nature of these qualities. First is that they fall on the soft side of the types of qualifications organizations often look for in new hires. And the second thing is that with just a couple exceptions, they are not typically taught in schools of journalism and mass communications. In fact, some may reject the idea that such traits can be taught, falling back on that old adage that leaders are born, not made. But research in this area suggests otherwise. In fact, leadership scholars now estimate that only 30% of leadership ability is innate, while 70% is attributable to training. With regard to those innate abilities, a recent global study by Ketchum Public Relations reported good news for female students and professionals. This firm surveyed 6,500 people around the world, examining their perceptions of leaders in business and politics and community, nonprofit and union and organized labor organizations. They looked at 7 key traits that they had identified important for leadership, finding that women ranked higher than men on 5 of them. These were leading by example, communicating in an open and transparent way, admitting mistakes, bringing out the best in others, and handling controversial issues or crises. But there's a but. The study also found that more than half of the respondents identified male leaders as most likely to steer global populations through the events of the next few years. In other words, men are still perceived to be the stronger leaders. And this is one reason, perhaps, that glass ceiling that Hillary Clinton said had about 18 million cracks in it still hasn't fallen. Another reason, however, and Carolyn pointed this out, is that women themselves often don't see themselves as leaders. For the students here in the room and joining us virtually, do you see yourself as a leader? I was raised in a home in which Mom and the girls cooked the dinner, washed the dishes, while Dad and my brother retired to the living room to watch TV. In the rural community where I grew up, it was commonly accepted that the girls were either going to become stay-at-home moms, or if they worked outside the home, the opportunities were pretty much limited to becoming a secretary or maybe a secondary school teacher. In other words, few aspired to becoming doctors or lawyers or communications executives. For a girl to reject that kind of thinking, it took a lot of personal courage, hard work, a good education, and a lot of great mentors along the way to help me learn how to lead. Unfortunately, these types of cultural and social barriers still exist. And so Carolyn is now going to talk about some strategies for dealing with those kinds of issues and things that you might think about as the students here for learning how to lead.
Thanks. Well, Kathy, you've made some really great points. And I want to reiterate that we want to tell students everywhere who may be watching today or watching later that even if you don't have access to a formal class in leadership at your university, there are a number of proven strategies that you can use to develop yourself as a leader, to really maximize that 70% figure that Kathy shared earlier regarding the percentage of leadership that is learned behavior rather than innate skill. So what I'm going to do is discuss 5 practices of exemplary leadership that students can adapt for their own use, and offer you some examples of how you might go about on your own campus practicing those skills of exemplary leadership. All right, the vision for developing yourself as a leader is to become a thoughtful, skilled, and reflective professional who is equipped to create positive social, and I think we could add organizational change. Everyone has the potential to exercise leadership, whether you're in a formal leadership position or not. There are leadership opportunities all around us, and you will find as you transition into the workplace, if you haven't noticed it already, that there's been a flattening of the organizational hierarchy, that leadership is expected at every level. Interns are expected to lead in the areas that they're responsible for. It's not just leadership at the very top now. Leadership is something that is woven throughout our organizational culture. So it's important to start now as a student learning how to lead. Finally, you can assess and develop your abilities. Even if you feel inside right now like you can't lead, you can. You can develop those abilities so that you become more confident in yourself as a leader and more capable of providing leadership. You know, sometimes writers say to one another, writing begets writing. The idea that if you write every day, the more you write, the more your brain thinks about writing and the more you produce. I think it's the same with leadership. Leadership begets leadership. If you have one successful experience as a leader, even if it's something relatively small, it gives you the confidence and the belief in yourself to take on the next leadership opportunity, and so on and so on. So start small, and you'll end up, hopefully, really taking on large leadership responsibilities and feeling capable of doing so. All right, let's look at how to develop yourself as a leader. I want to recommend this book to you. This is a terrific book by James Koussis and Barry Posner, The Leadership Challenge. This is the latest edition, is 2007. And they lay out a set of practices or skills that they refer to as the 5 practices of exemplary leadership. And again, even if you don't have a class in leadership at your university, this is something you really can do on your own. So let me take you through the 5 skills. The first one is called model the way. And in modeling the way, you find your voice by clarifying your personal values. and you set an example by aligning your actions with those values. And it really has to do with credibility. The most important personal quality that people tend to look for and admire in a leader is personal credibility. And credibility is often said to be the foundation of leadership. If people believe in you, if they believe in your message, and they believe in you, the messenger, they will follow you. So someone can have the title of a leader, but leadership has to be earned through personal credibility. So here's an example, as a university captain of a volleyball team. I always showed up early to practice, and I often stayed late. There was nothing I wasn't willing to do. I wasn't too good to mop the floor or too cool to shout words of encouragement to a freshman. I knew that my actions spoke louder than my words, so I made sure to show people what to do rather than tell them what. This is a student leader who's modeling the way, who's essentially saying, like, we're a basketball team, right? We have to be supportive across the board to make this team the best it can be. Showing up early, cheering on all the players, that's modeling the way. That's a practice of exemplary leadership. The second one that Kouzis and Posner point out is inspiring a shared vision. This is a way of envisioning the future by imagining exciting and noble possibilities. What could be better in your world, at your university, in your fraternity or sorority? What could be better than what exists today? And then enlist others in that vision by creating excitement around shared aspirations. So I think this next one is a great example. This is a student who wanted to make her college more green and more environmentally responsible. I went from classroom to dorms, and to student organizations, talking about how we could increase recycling, turn out lights in empty classrooms, turn off computers left on all weekend in empty labs. I formed a group, and we presented a plan to the administration. They were thrilled to have student group support. This is a major opportunity for leadership that was not a formal leadership position. It was just one student envisioning how she could save energy on her college campus, and then getting other students on board with that idea and speaking up about it. Look around your university, look around your various student organizations. What could be better? How could the future be brighter? And then start talking about it and getting people on board with you. That leading and inspiring a shared vision is another practice of exemplary leadership. The third one, challenge the process. This involves searching for opportunities by seeking innovative ways, new ways to change, grow, and improve. It has to do with experimenting and taking risks by constantly generating small wins and learning from mistakes. This is a person who's willing to challenge the system to get new products, processes, services, and systems adopted. Here's a great example. This one's actually from my own campus. We had a student who wanted to start a daily college broadcast journalism program. We did not have one. And she said, no, and this is sadly true, no faculty member was willing to take the time to try and make our idea work because everyone thought that the chances for success were too slim. Through my persistence to challenge the process and do something that had never been done before on our campus, we were able to get resources and launch our show. I also needed to ensure that everyone on the committee believed that together, one hurdle at a time, we could make anything happen. So this is a great example of a student who challenged the process. No daily broadcast show. How do we get the resources to make that happen? Let's challenge the system. Let's not take no for the answer, but let's push to make something happen. That's another practice of exemplary leadership. The fourth, enabling others to act. This has to do with fostering collaboration by promoting cooperative goals and building trust, strengthening others by working as a team. So really great leaders are great collaborators. Leaders know that they have to engage all those around them who have to make the project work. They also have to engage everyone who has to live with the results of that project. And leaders are people who make it possible for everyone to do excellent work. So here's an example from a winning Bateman competition team leader. And some of you who are public relations majors may have competed in Bateman. And she said, working on Bateman taught me that a good leader is a team player. And to be a team player, one must offer encouragement and be willing to listen to others' ideas. Working with others and getting everyone to participate actively requires trust. For example, we gave each member the chance to conduct research and pitch campaign strategy ideas. Decisions were made as a group. Another key to success is that in order to gain respect as a leader, you must also show respect for others. So this is someone who exercised leadership by promoting positive collaboration among a team. And that's a practice of exemplary leadership. Finally, encourage the heart. This is a practice of leadership where you are generous and you recognize contributions by showing appreciation for individual excellence. It's a way of celebrating the values and victories of others by creating a spirit of community. So here's an example from a shift supervisor for our campus tour guide program. I knew that many of my coworkers felt underappreciated and poorly paid for our campus jobs when cutbacks meant that we couldn't have raises. But I wanted to try to turn around this situation. I would constantly praise and commend the tour guides for their actions. And more important, I tried to make it clear that we were making a difference to our university and to prospective students. I looked for ways to make our workplace fun. And whenever anyone achieved something special, we all stopped to give that person a high five or a string of way to go chants. That's a practice of exemplary leadership, appreciating others, making others want to aspire to excellence, celebrating victories of the people in your team and your community, and creating a spirit of community. So again, I really strongly recommend this book to you. It's an outstanding way for students and for instructors as well to start thinking about the practices and the model of leadership and how to incorporate that into everyday life as well as into courses. So a question is, can new college graduates lead? And the answer is yes, they can, but they're not typically well trained to do so. So what I want to urge you today, and I know Kathy feels the same, is don't let a lack of formal leadership education stop you. Use this 5 practices framework, and there are other frameworks as well, but this is one that I think is really nicely described and easy to get your arms around. Use the 5 practices framework to look for problem solving and decision-making opportunities. What Kathy was talking about earlier as the qualities that we're most seeking in leaders, these have to do primarily with problem solving and decision making and teamwork. Seek to develop your group interaction and encouragement skills, and view the university around you and your internships, your higher education settings as really ripe with opportunities to practice leadership, as we've just seen in these 5 different case examples. And finally, before we open to questions, I want to just mention to you the idea of the leadership portfolio, which is an idea that's gaining a lot of credibility and a lot of ground at universities nationwide. You know, a lot of you out there may have a creative portfolio that you've been developing or a writing portfolio. But leadership skills can and should be showcased in a portfolio too. Why not use those 5 practices to structure a leadership portfolio? You have 5 sections to your portfolio, and in each section you would build examples of how you've developed expertise like encouraging the heart. Tell your story through your portfolio of your emerging leadership profile, your leadership roles, and your leadership experiences. And remember, these don't have to be formal leadership experiences. They can be taking a leadership role in a team project, a group project from class. And tell the story of your emerging leadership philosophy, the behaviors that you endorse as a leader. And the more that you engage with these ideas and see yourself actively practicing them, the more that you will grow as a leader. Before we open to questions, I want to just mention that many of the ideas that I've shared today and that Kathy has shared today, appear in a new piece that we have published together in the current issue of Journalism and Mass Communication Educator. And that piece is called Preparing Tomorrow's Leaders, Integrating Leadership Development in Journalism and Mass Communication Education. You can certainly go to Journalism and Mass Communication Educator, the current issue, and read the piece that Kathy and I have co-authored. All right, so let me I think turn it back to Maria Elena and open it up to questions.
Great, thank you so much to both of you. A lot of things to think about. So those of you in the room, if you want to write questions and send them to me since you don't have microphones, and I'll be happy to share them. And same, those of you online, please go ahead and enter your questions on the chat feature, and we will get to them. So in the meantime, I mean, I have a lot of questions about how all these things that you've talked about translate from an educator's perspective. What can we do as educators to encourage students to take on informal leadership, to not shoot down their leadership ideas when they bring them to us, because we might not have the time or the resources to do it? How can we do it even among our peers and people that we supervise and staff members? Specifically, do you have any thoughts on people that are in technical positions of leadership and what they can do to encourage leadership?
The faculty to take the lead on initiatives and give them the support that they need. I mean, if someone comes to us with a good idea, like the student Carolyn mentioned for the broadcast program, rather than, oh no, can't do it, never done it, don't have any money, would never happen here, well, maybe, I mean, so we talk about a leadership mindset on behalf of students, but I think sometimes we have to shift our own mind settings, and we have to really think about how we are preparing students to lead. What would this experience mean? And I think as we develop more, as we begin the conversation among various faculties about how do we incorporate leadership and look at the qualities and think about how do you teach this, it's really tough. But how do we teach this? How do we come up with opportunities within the teaching hospital model, for example, to incorporate ways for students to collaborate, to lead teams and things like that. So I think empowerment is key, and then letting students run with it. And sometimes I think one of the hardest parts about being a leader is letting go. I mean, if you want to make it perfect, you got to do it yourself, right? Well, you know what? That's not always the case. And if we as leaders, whatever that means, whatever levels, can sometimes let go and let others lead and, you know, step in before the disaster strikes, of course. But to take a step back and delegate authority and responsibility and accountability so that as students develop their leadership skills, they understand that this is a big responsibility, especially if they're working with other people, but they also need to be accountable for the decisions they make. That's a big part of leadership.
And the challenge too is that it requires tolerance for mistakes, tolerance for people doing in a style and approach that's different from yours, and I think that's probably something that current leaders need to develop as well. Carolyn, do you want to add something to? Okay, I mean, and another thing that you addressed, but I'd like maybe for you to talk a little bit about.
I'm going to stick with Kathy's
response on that. There's informal leadership, and then there's leadership that comes with titles and prestige and salaries and things like that, right? So, you know, part of fostering leadership is to empower this informal leadership. But ultimately, what's studied, right, what's seen as the outcome of true empowerment is that more women have titles and have management positions. So can you talk a little bit maybe about how important it is for women to actually get titles versus being an informal leader in their organization?
Well, I mean, I certainly can't dispute that it's important for women to have titles. I mean, I opened with the very damning statistic that we have so few women leaders in the position of CEO of Fortune 500 companies. But I think, you know, we're looking for a balance. I think among students, we really need to be paying attention to developing leadership abilities, leadership training, leadership expertise, so that they will have the confidence and the trajectory, the leadership trajectory to move into the roles and actually have the titles. I think there's also feeling, the importance of feeling your own credibility as a leader. And I think that starts at the university setting with what we can do to train students to have self-efficacy as leaders, to really understand that they can make things around them happen. They can solve problems. They can create teams. They can create a vision of how things could be better. Even if no one, the student example I gave, where the student wanted the college to be greener. No one came to her with that as a class project. She looked around and said, I can help move this forward. So I think what we need to do is to help students, male and female, really develop themselves as leaders and understand themselves as leaders, and that the rest hopefully should naturally follow. That there are ladders to climb, there are professional trajectories. Women certainly are getting titles in all of our fields, university, higher ed, corporate, etc. But we have to better prepare them to go the distance and not stop at sort of mid-level. The idea, of not reaching, let's say, associate.
Could I add something like there too?
Right there.
I also think that perceptions are so important in terms of having formal titles. I mean, how many of us have watched
to go for the goal.
A program at a conference or on television where you got a bunch of white men on the panel? Where are the women? Okay? Forget about other diversity. I mean, there are no women. What's up with that? And we think about that, I think, when we put programs together, we want to have the gender balance and so forth. But I think the perception matters because students see that consciously, unconsciously, and it gets back to my point, and I'm very conscious about this, is thinking about what you can be, what you can do. And I think that begins at a very young age, but certainly for students as you're thinking about career paths and so forth. So if we have strong women, let's use that word, in formal leadership positions, then it allows you to have mentors, of course, and but more importantly, role models too. Something that, it's just the way life works. It's not the good old boy system anymore, that women are just as likely to be promoted and that expectation exists, that I have as much shot at that job as the male counterpart does, because that's, I'm going to be based on my qualifications. We have a ways to go, sure, but that's why I think this whole idea of Hillary Clinton becoming president, I mean, that's the picture, right? That's the vision. So I think formal titles matter. Informal leadership is important, sometimes in helping you get to those formal positions, but I do think the titles matter.
So in terms of, you mentioned specific competencies and traits, and, it is interesting because, competencies, I guess you teach, and traits are inherent, right? But if 70% of good leadership can be achieved through training, you mentioned some of these competencies / traits, right? Being a visionary, being proactive, being empathetic, being flexible, being courageous, being ethical. What would a curriculum look like to teach that, right? And I don't know if you have the answer. Maybe this is, the next step of the work group. But what does, how can you get people to develop empathy and being a visionary and being supportive of others?
And Carolyn, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think we don't have the answer yet. I think that this is a question that we are struggling with, and we're not the only ones. There are a lot of people in our fields who are talking about leadership and trying to figure out how to develop it in journalism and mass communication programs in a way that has some specificity and applicability to our fields, as opposed to taking the model from agricultural education or business schools and just putting, just landing that into our field without tailoring it. So I don't think we have a great answer for you. But I think that, there are elements that we recognize, like collaboration, like teamwork, like the personal efficacy piece of it, that we have to start weaving into our courses. And the first courses are really just starting to be taught. I'm about to start teaching in a week a graduate seminar called Women in Leadership. So maybe I need to come back and do another webinar with you in 3 months to tell you how that class
And I
went.
think it's also kind of the
So there is
natural
no easy answer
evolution
yet.
of curriculum
Just the
development,
fact
as I
that
was
we're talking
saying.
about it,
So for
we're
so
paying
long,
attention to it,
communication programs
and we're
focused
thinking
on
about how
technical
to develop our
skills,
students
and then we
this way. I
managed to
think
move that
that is
along
the
a bit
first
and
step, and
incorporate
it's
the
the biggest
management
step.
skills. Well, it's really time to add the leadership component, and sometimes it means teaching a class on management, or crisis management, or counseling, or something else. And so I think that what Carolyn is saying is absolutely right. Teaching a class on leadership is a good indicator that we think this is important. This is an important subject for our students. So, and then the question becomes is what's the content? How do we teach it? As I was saying, some of the questions that you get back to. But the fact that we're having the conversation or beginning the conversation, I think is very exciting, and it's terrific for students to be thinking about these kinds of issues.
I want to add to that. I think it also means that we've talked for a decade about experiential learning. This is experiential learning, and it's looking at the types of experiences that are formative for a leader, and trying to build them into our courses. And there are certain courses, like if you teach a course around the Bateman competition or the Effies, that kind of course really lends itself to leadership experiences. It's just obvious, the creation of a team, working together towards a shared goal, competing for a win, that all is part of leadership. But then I think there's also something like revisiting our internships. I mean, there's not a JMC program in the world that doesn't give student credit for internships, but what are the interns actually doing? I think we have to start redefining what is important for a student to take out of an internship. It's not just a line on a resume that says I was in a newsroom. What do they need to take from that experience? What kinds of experiences do they need to have as an intern?
And I think we have some models and examples as well. I teach ethics, and I remember a time when we didn't know how to teach ethics, whether we should teach ethics. Is it something that students can learn? You're either ethical or you're not ethical. You're either a leader or you're not a leader. But we've come a long way, I think, in developing an ethics curriculum, and I think that's important. I can remember being on a panel once with the head of a big healthcare company, and the focus was on business ethics, and the students in the room were saying to him, well, how do you know what to do when you're faced with an ethical dilemma? And his answer was, well, you just know. And that was so unsatisfactory for the students. So, and as I sat there, I thought we have such an obligation to show them the way, so to speak, and I use that in a curricular sense. How can we give them decision-making models that will allow them to reach more ethical outcomes, or at least understand the intricacies and the implications of the decisions that they make? And so I think there are some models there in ethics training that we could look to for leadership training as well.
So we have several questions from the audience regarding mentoring. This is a recurring theme in the Kopenhaver Center webinar series. Of course, there's mentorship and sponsorship, right, and just kind of advising. But what can you recommend to a student or a young professional looking to develop their leadership skills in terms of seeking out a mentor, or selecting a mentor, how to work with a mentor, or even ask someone to be their mentor?
Oh, I want to suggest something to read, something brief to read that I read this week that I thought was very important. So my colleague, Ron Culp, who certainly the public relations students and educators who are paying attention will know Ron, affiliated certainly with Ketchum Public Relations, and he is the professional director of our graduate master's program in PR and ad here at DePaul. So he maintains a wonderful blog called Culprit, Culpwrit, Culprit. And he published something on his blog this week that was really quite remarkable to me. It was a discussion of the extent to which students fail to network. And he described visiting some major PR and ad agencies in Chicago and hearing the CEOs or creative directors, very, very high up senior leadership at these agencies, inviting the class of students to link in. with that, to link in after the presentation, to connect on LinkedIn. And so Ron spoke to a few of these CEOs as the basis of this blog and said, how many of the students take you up on it? And the CEOs and creative directors laughed and they said, none, or at most one will network, will link in. And so he wrote about it on the blog because he wanted to make the point that networking is where it all starts, and networking is really the student's responsibility. The creative director doesn't really need to network with the student. It goes the other way. So I want to say one really important thing about finding a great mentor, finding a sponsor, has to do with your level of outreach. Great mentors and sponsors don't typically fall from the sky and announce themselves to us. They're relationships that have to be cultivated and they have to be developed. So keep that, go read that Culprit blog. I think it's really, that story, that piece on networking is so important. And if you're a student who's watching this, remember the importance of linking in and reaching out. You will be amazed at the goodwill that you engender as a student. It's a very special time in your career when people will talk with you, will let you do an informational interview, will give you job advice. People feel very warm towards students. So use this time in your professional life to start building a network, and hopefully a sponsor or a mentor emerges out of that network. It's a very holistic process of discovering someone who has skills and expertise and is interested in you.
That is approaching a mentor, or someone who is maybe in a new leadership position or something like that. What do you want that mentor to show you? What do you want that mentor to help you with?
Well, in my experience, you don't just go to someone new to you. A mentoring relationship evolves over time. And so I think that, it's one of those, you're looking at people in the company or outside the company, say, I want that person for a mentor because they're so great. But if you don't really know that person's not going to be that interested in you. So I would look at folks who are in your world, but you could get to know better, and out of your discipline or out of your field a little bit too. It doesn't have to be someone who is seated next to you in the office, for example. When I first became an educator, I went into a program that had, I think, one other person in my field. But when I took the job, I was new at this myself. I have to find folks who will help me. And so I reached out nationally. And it's kind of like Carolyn is saying, when you start reaching out with common interests, concerns, shared objectives and goals and things like that, then I think you'll find that people will be open to working with you. But, so I would say try to develop relationships with people who you would like to get to know, who you admire, who you respect. You want your mentor to be a role model, somebody who you can trust, and then let that relationship evolve. I don't know if you can create mentors. I mean, I've been involved, we all know about formal mentoring programs, and I think that's a really good idea, but I think sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work, because sometimes you just don't click, and you really need somebody who's always got your back. You can have a bad, a situation, they're going to tell you the truth. You don't want somebody to be rah-rah all the time and, you can't do any better. You want somebody who's going to look you in the eye, at least I do, and say, boy, you really messed that up. And here's how maybe you want to think about trying to fix it. So, it's all about relationships, I think.
Yeah, I would add to that also that it's not always a situation where there's one mentor who can wear all hats for you. You typically need several mentors who have different types of skills. So in your organization, there might be someone that you recognize has a tremendous amount of social capital with the other people in the organization, and that person might end up being a mentor about how to develop positive working relationships. And then there might be someone else who you notice has had a very steady ascent up the corporate ladder, and you admire that and want to model that, so that person becomes a role model to you and a mentor to you about next jobs, the next steps up the ladder. But it's rare that you would find one person who could mentor you across all areas. And then to answer the original question, Maria Elena, about what advice would we give to someone in a new organization, I think, cast your net wide is the way to start. Identify 4 promising individuals who seem like they might have something to teach you or offer in the way of a mentor, and ask them if you could set up monthly coffees just to talk about what's going on and talk about your experience. And over time, if there's a mentor relationship there, it will shake out. It will make it.
And I was just going to add one more thing, and that is get out of your office.
Start by casting your net wide.
We women have a tendency sometimes, I think, and I just read something about this not that long ago, to sit in our offices and do good work and get our job done and do it well, because surely somebody's going to recognize me and, look at what a hard worker I am. And I don't know if there's any stats on this, but apparently men are better at networking within some office structures than we are, because we're harder work. I don't know if we're harder workers. I wouldn't say that go that far, but I think there's this mentality. At least I may have that myself, that I don't get out enough. And I can remember being a very young PR person for a big oil and gas company, and I had to write annual report copy about oil and gas. Think about that if you're looking for career paths, right? I didn't know anything about oil and gas, so I identified one of the engineers, and I went and sat in his office, very old guy, almost near retirement, and I said, I'm new at this, can you help me? And we established this amazing relationship such that when it was annual or quarterly report time, he'd pick up the phone and call me, said, hey, isn't it time for us to visit? And I thought, that is so cool, because it was a relationship that evolved because I reached out to him and said, I need your help. And here's what I'm doing, I want to succeed, will you help me? And he could have said no. But he didn't, and it evolved into this really great relationship, and he was supporting my success. He was supporting me as I grew into becoming a professional, and that's what you want to look for, people who will say, yes, I'll help you.
So another set of questions, another theme here in the questions that were submitted is about, people that are currently in leadership or management positions, right? People that have these titles, they don't necessarily have all these wonderful leadership traits, right? That's part of it is also, so one of the questions is, what do you think current leaders are lacking? Maybe how could we address that? And a related question, you mentioned that perception of women and women's abilities and women's limitations because of life-family balance and things like that come from the current leadership, right? So what work can be done with current leaders to kind of nurture future leaders and not put up these barriers they might not even know that they're putting up?
We call that managing up, right? Mm-hmm. And I'll let Carolyn answer that question.
Well, I actually think that this idea of the 5 practices of exemplary leadership, the leadership portfolio, these aren't just for students. I think responsible professionals recognize that professional development is a career-long, is a lifelong responsibility. So just to give my own example, last summer I completed an online course on values-based learning, values-based leadership. And something that I learned about myself, can you see? Sorry, we kind of went out there. Can you guys see me? There we go. Something that I learned about myself in that course was that I was not really a very adept listener, that I was engaging in that practice of just waiting for my turn to talk next and planning out what I was going to say and not really listening very carefully to what the person talking to me was saying. So I think that we all have a responsibility to work on these leadership traits throughout our professional careers. Now, not everyone recognizes that, and so you may be in a situation where you are reporting to a leader who doesn't respect family time, doesn't respect personal boundaries, doesn't listen well, doesn't look for promotion opportunities. This is very difficult. I don't know that there's a great answer for this. I think you can have an open and honest conversation. I think that you can look for ways to change policies in your workplace. You can get a group together that says, well, we want to have an open conversation about flex time, issues like that, or commuting. Like virtual job work. So to cut out a day of commuting, sort of the different options that people in today's workplace are interested in. I think the best that you can do is have open communication and try to encourage the people who are leading in your organization to think openly and broadly.
And I would agree with that, and I think that we old folks in the room would say to you that there are points in your careers when you've tried to manage up and you just have a boss who is not working for you. And it's time to move on. Don't let a bad boss keep you down. Move yourself into a position that you out of bed with a smile on your face every day and you go to work happy. Because everybody's not going to be a great leader. And Maria Elena is absolutely right. People find themselves in these leadership positions sometimes and we shake our heads and go, how did that happen? And it happens for all kinds of reasons, but sometimes, you know, you're in a situation, you just have to take yourself out and take responsibility, as Carolyn said, for moving on into a better situation.
So we also have some questions about how do we get the nation talking about this, you know, about this situation and the need to change. They're likened it to the current hashtag Race Together effort from Starbucks, you know, to get people talking about the importance of race. And in the opening remarks, Carolyn talked about, you know, gender, you know, inclusion being really an issue of social justice that requires advocacy. So how can we bring this up without alienating people that don't want to hear this and don't want to think that it's an advocacy and social equality?
Yeah. Well, I would just have a short answer, and then Carolyn studies women's issues, so she's far more expert in answering that question than I am. But I would just go back to my thought about you know, this is a conversation not just for women, and so we really need to think about that. And on women's groups and things like that, I haven't been that involved myself. In fact, I jokingly said to Carolyn that maybe I'm going to write a new book that says, "So I am a feminist," because I've come to some of these issues a little late in my career. But I think that we got to get the men. You know, it's an issue for everybody. It's not a women's issue. I mean, the stats, the data speak for themselves. And so I think as more studies come out, the research shows that companies make more money if they have women on their boards, and you know, we can promote some of that kind of understanding and knowledge. I think that we will see some change. But I think you're absolutely right. People shy away from these kinds of discussions because they don't want to get involved with that women's stuff, you know, and that's real. That's really real. People get branded, and that's bad for careers. So we do have to be sensitive to those perceptions.
I don't know that we have to raise it. Maria Elena, you asked, how do we raise it? How do we bring it to the front? I think it's there. I mean, I think Lean In has been really transforming for this conversation, and you really couldn't have a better spokesperson than the COO of Facebook leading this charge. The fact that Marjorie Scardino was added to the board of Twitter, that was because of public pressure, because there were articles in all of our leading media saying this is outrageous, that Twitter is about to have its initial public offering and go public, and there's not a single woman on the board. When the Wall Street Journal released that list of 17 male CEOs, et cetera, from information companies who were the keynoters for their technology conference, the blogosphere went wild. Twitter went wild. Everything was lit up with this is outrageous. There's not a single woman in the entire world who can keynote at a Wall Street Journal technology conference. Really? You know, I mean, I think these issues are real at the forefront. This is a great moment for this conversation because people are paying so much attention, and social media is helping so much to spread the word and to get people on board with these discussions. So I think we have our foot on the pedal, and I think we just have to keep it there and keep the pressure up and make sure, going back to the education piece of this, that we are moving a generation of young women through the pipeline who are ready to lead, who are ready to step up for these opportunities, because they are there and they're only going to broaden, I think, happily.
Well, thank you to both of you. We're out of time, so I would like to close the webinar, thanking again Carolyn Bronstein and Kathy Fitzpatrick for this great conversation that we will surely keep going within our university.